Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Region Rundown. My special guest today is a man that if you don't know who he is, if you have been living under a rock, if you haven't been watching any League of Legends at all, it's Nymaera, of both co-founder of the unofficial LJL English broadcast, but also caster for the LPL and guest caster for the LEC. I mean, this guy's been kind of around the block. He has yet to do NA, has yet to do KR, but we'll see in the future, right? I mean, you're almost there. You're collecting all the Infinity Stones of League of Legends casting.
Closest thing I got to KR was doing, I did an academy tournament for China, Korea, and the Asian minor regions as well. Like, so I've cast some Korean players in that sense. NA, I did a collegiate thing once. I did a high school tournament, I think, for one of the state tournaments. So, but I've never gotten higher than that. But hey, I mean, I'm open to all regions. You know, equal opportunity casting here.
And so for anybody that doesn't know, he will be here to talk about the LPL representatives, world representatives, specifically both LNG and WBG. So Weibo Gaming and I forgot LNG's actual.
It's just LNG.
It's just LNG, right? Yeah.
So in terms of, I'm pretty sure it does stand for something. It doesn't stand for anything in their actual official title for LPL. So I forgot it.
Oh, I'm glad.
I know JDG is Jingdong Gaming.
Jingdong Gaming. So, yeah. I'm glad I'm not looking like a scrub out here for not knowing what LNG stands for. But yeah, since there are 4 world's representatives, I've asked Nymaera to talk about the 2 of them. We are going to get into first kind of the expectations of the LPL this year, because a lot of major moves happened after last Worlds. Obviously, the shock that DRX winning Worlds kind of, I wouldn't say, you know, was a huge thing, but it kind of shook the free agent market a little bit, right?
Okay, in terms of pre-tournament expectations, that is the most unlikely Worlds win besides maybe Season 2 TPA. But that was a very different time.
That was a different time.
Yeah. I think this is the largest Worlds upset we will potentially ever see beyond this point. A 4th seed like that. That team was legitimately only good for 1 patch. And you can see exactly before and after that point, like they were completely off the boat. Exactly. You know, I chose to talk about these 2 teams, LNG and Weibo, and I'm sure other people would be like, but why aren't you talking about JDG? What about BLG? Those are the teams which are so good. I actually think the 2 teams here, they have a lot to them, and I think they're very, very interesting. So I thought, you know what, let's dig into them a little bit. So if you're going to talk about expectations, yeah, I think both of these teams are very high up on the list in terms of the big storylines for the LPL, diving into the specifics of those big storylines within those teams. There was a lot of change in the LPL offseason, as you were saying.
Yeah.
Globally, yes, but then also within LPL, we had pretty much every single big franchise player leaving their big team and going somewhere else. So we had Scout going from EDG to LNG. We had Xiaohu going from RNG to Weibo. We had Knight going from Top Esports to JDG. We had Rookie going from V5 and then, which of course became NIP this year, I guess. But he went to Top Esports. Huge changes there. Yagao went from JDG to BLG. Yeah. We had Gala going from RNG to LNG. Every big player you can think of, besides maybe like TheShy, who was already on Weibo, like they all changed. Everyone pretty much went about the way. Even like Ming on RNG left. So there are a lot of big questions about how much are things going to change, because the big play, is it a question of the big players being great on their own, or was it a chemistry and a combination between them and the organization, or them and a certain teammate, or them and a certain coach? So we were left with a lot of different questions, but on paper we still had some absolutely stacked rosters. JDG was obviously the biggest one. You took an already incredible existing jungle support duo between Kanavi and Missing, and then you added the 2 best carries in the world, arguably, Knights and Rulers. You think, okay, that's really good. But then also the other 2 teams outside of that were actually Top Esports, because you had, you know, Tien, who's always been on very reputable teams, despite the fact that Tien has his downs, and most of the teams that are bombed out of group stage of Worlds have been Tien teams.
He's the LPL king. He's the LPL jungle goat, in my opinion. And then he just like, for whatever reason, he's just like super high, and then Worlds comes around. It's so weird, and the pairing of Tien and you know, all these kinds of things. It was. I love him. Yeah. He's one of my favorite players. But yeah, go on.
But so obviously, speaking to that, you can say that about most, because you also had you know, Rookie and Jackie Love on the Top Esports team, and then you had this Weibo team as well, which had TheShy, and it had Xiaohu on it, and it had Casa, and it had Crisp. So you have 4 international title holders. Xiaohu being arguably the greatest LPL player of all time in the mid lane as well. And then you had Light as an AD carry, who's had an incredible run of form since about 2020? He was in play-ins with the LNG team. I think it was. I think that was when Light and Ala, and it was Lumao in the mid lane as support as well. So like that was an incredibly stacked team. So we had 3 arguable super teams, to greater and less degrees other teams across the Rift as well. And even then we had teams like LNG, which were very, very stacked, right? Because you had Tarzan, who of course came from the Griffin roster, had some great results on LNG. Well, had some great regular season roster results with LNG, but never really made that stick out in playoffs. They made Worlds once, but you had finally Tarzan with Scout, incredible mid laner as well. You had, and then you also had, Zika, who was the largest buyout of the offseason from 22 to 23, being coming into that team as well. So there was an awful lot of change and an awful lot of potential, but it was really hard to know where the needle was going to land on that one, because it was a lot of moving pieces in regards to actually how's the chemistry going to work? Is it certain organizations and coaches as well as the players coming in there? So that was the kind of expectations, and we kind of like benchmarked some of these teams to say, oh, Weibo, very high expectations. LNG, well, we don't know. They've not delivered on promises before because they've done all this regular season stuff, but they haven't done it in playoffs. And in spring, I think the 2 teams which we're talking about here, LNG and Weibo, they were teams that promised very high, and they were both knocked out by teams which then delivered better than them in playoffs. So Weibo were knocked out by BLG, who of course went on to go do 2 best of 5s versus JDG, went on to become MSI finalists and finished 2nd place there as well after beating, they beat T1. And of course, LNG on the other side lost to a rampant OMG at that point, who were really world class at that point. Sadly, they didn't make it through to MSI, and they bombed out in summer as well. But it seems like both these 2 teams, which I want to talk about, they had very, very high expectations. And then in spring, despite the fact that LNG were like our 3rd best teams in regular season, and Weibo were one of our pre-year favorites, both of them kind of bombed out. And it's really taken until this summer for them to realize some of those expectations again.
Yeah, and so the first kind of team I think I'd want to talk about, I think far more interesting conversation, if to some extent, is this Weibo Gaming roster, right? Of TheShy, WeiWei, Xiaohu, like Chris Xiaohu, who obviously, this guy is world-class on top lane, took his talents back to mid lane, by the way, right? He went back to mid, so you know what? Let's run it back. Let me go back to my lane. Let's figure out what we can do. Pairs him up with TheShy, and then you have Light and Chris in that bot lane. Obviously, Light, I think he played on like FPX and other sort of rosters here. But this team, I feel like there's 2 sort of areas you can put them in. It's TheShy if he reconnects as IG TheShy, and then there's also flashes of just like, oh yeah, this is TheShy that like inted on Kennen like last, like this kind of stuff. Like there's 2 Shys that, depending on which one you get, they can either be like a world's winner, in my opinion, or world beater, or they might just flunk out and they might just like drop a game to an NA team or an EU team here. Can you talk to me more about like after, maybe spring, why this team can show such high highs and then give you some of the most deepest gut-wrenching losses, I believe, in the LPL?
There are 2 ways to put this. One is slightly more polite. The other one is maybe slightly more realistic. The polite way of saying is that they play to the level of their opponents. Now, they're a team which has lost to a 0-7 loss streak IG, and they have won against JDG. They have actually won both of their best of 3s versus JDG this entire year. Now, they've not played best of 5s, but in best of 1s, they are 4-1 versus JDG, who are on the Golden Road, and that's obviously a huge scalp for them to take. They battle it out with the best teams, and they lose to the very worst teams that comes to it. The less polite way, and maybe more realistic way of saying they're consistently inconsistent. As you said, sometimes it feels like you have a certain version of TheShy or various other players on the Rift that will just connect in various forms. I think in spring that very much applied to Caster as well. Caster had some dreadful games. It felt like him and Xiaohu were not connecting particularly well. I think that Caster and Chris were not connecting particularly well. And that was the big problem, right? You have TheShy of Invictus Gaming fame. You have the Xiaohu of RNG fame. You have Caster of also RNG fame, but also other rosters too across the LPL. And you can say that for pretty much every player on this roster. I actually think WeiWei coming into summer helped them kind of step into these great old gods of the LPL, several of which are in, of course, the LPL top 10 players of all time, which came out this year because it was the LPL's 10th anniversary. So the players and coaching staff and whatever voted on that. Now, I don't think it was a particularly accurate list. I would actually put like Xiaohu up at like number 2 or number 1. I actually think he's way higher than he should be at that list. And WeiWei is a player that's never been to Worlds before. He is still fairly fresh. He's not a rookie player, but he's still fairly fresh. And what he ended up doing was just playing a really good kind of linking playstyle with the rest of his lanes. I think a great game to watch. What he ended up culminating in, and why actually this team has done very well, is I believe it was game 1 of Weibo's first best of 5 in regionals, so versus Top Esports. That went to 5 games. It was an utterly brilliant series. Terrible and great in equal measures from TheShy. But WeiWei had a great game on Poppy where he ganks like all 3 lanes just on repeat. It's an incredible game from him.
He's a maniac. He's an absolute maniac on the champion, by the way.
Yeah, and he just did such a good job of linking with his lanes in the way that Casa didn't. I think that was a huge way to unlock some of those kind of like early game worries from Weibo. Because Weibo, when they get ahead, they tend to stay ahead. They're very good at stabilizing, snowballing games once they have a lead and then closing out games. It's the problem is just like, if they make those certain plays and fall behind, they just double down and lose even harder, which we also saw in that game versus Top Esports. So I think WeiWei is a big difference maker for this team, and it helps at least alleviate some of the inconsistency worries.
It feels like, Weibo is kind of like the ultimate skill check team when I look at them, right? Like they're constantly trying to like test your mechanics and test your hands because, and I keep hating to bring the point back up to this guy, but TheShy, like, this guy will just like turbo stomp lane sometimes, right? Get like 2-0 leads, 3-0 leads, and then he's off pushing the side lane. And then like the rest of Weibo looks so confused because they're setting up for an objective onto the bot side, or they're looking for like a jungle play, aggressing into like maybe red side, right? They're looking for something else to do while TheShy is kindly put creating pressure or creating this vacuum of pressure, I would say. Can you maybe talk to about the disjointedness that WBG has? Is it just simply that there's 4 Chinese players and TheShy is a Korean player? Because I feel like that communication point, I don't think you can lean on that anymore as like an issue because the integration of Korean players into the LPL has been so apparent and so long now that I don't really buy that anymore.
So I think we've seen this a little bit worldwide. The other player I think of this genuinely is Ebby on Heretics in the LEC, where I think that half of it. Well, this thing, right? Because I think actually these are both players which have been by certain big names in the community. They've been really dunked on hard, and I think half of it's true. I think other half of it is missing the context of sometimes the player is put in a situation where their team is just never giving them anything to their lane. There was a game from TheShy on Rumble where he went something like 1-8. It was pretty disastrous. A lot of this started off from, yes, an early mistake in lane where they ended up dying early on, but then effectively the team just said, you are never getting anything top lane. And actually their wave state at that point was completely unplayable. And I think a lot of the time, I think even players like Odoamne from Europe have been in situations like this before. We accept the players like TheShy and Odoamne, and of course Ebby within his own region too, have had great runs of form. They are truly great older players. But sometimes, I think you see this in veteran top laners where they realize sometimes they have to die for a wave state, and they will have to die to reset their lane. It's like, look, if jungler shows top, I'm dead. But at least the wave will reset into a point where I can get the next 3 waves where I would have been zoned out of 4 waves otherwise, something like that. I think we have seen that sometimes when top lane has fallen behind for Weibo, the team does not know what to do with it. I think that WeiWei got much better at responding to top lane and winning top lane jungle 2v2s as opposed to leaving top lane out to dry so much later into summer and then into regionals as well. That's the good side of it. Then the bad side of it is sometimes the player will just overstay and they will overestimate themselves. And I think TheShy was particularly at fault for this, where you could see them massively pushing up no vision. Sometimes they were fighting in a heavy 1v1 top side while the bot side of the map was going for a dive on the bot lane turret. So it's like, okay, you can't make a play. This is basically League of Legends, folks. You can't make a play on both sides of the map very often. It's very rare that you win on bot side and on top side. So I think there are some mitigating factors. I don't want people to go into I think it is incorrect to follow the complete meme of, oh my god, it's TheShy, he's awful. I think that's completely incorrect. I think that, yes, 50% of the time, maybe even a little bit more than that, yes, they are making mistakes which put them into these positions, but sometimes the team is also not responding adequately to them also being in a bad lane state as well. I think that TheShy off of Renekton in regionals, which was a particularly poor game in regards to getting killed in side lanes after, had some really good lanes in regards to that afterwards. I think he had some Ornn games where he was playing lane and absorbing pressure very well, and then affecting team fights later. Game 5 versus Top Esports at Regionals, he had a Gwen game where he had to play a carry, he had to play on weak side as that carry, and he had to have damaging performances in a way which he hadn't been trusted with that before. Yes, he had high individual damage on stuff like Renekton and K'Sante, but that's because he was going 1v2 and dying the 90% of the game. This was a true carry performance from him, and if we see a little bit more of that, I have a lot more hope for Weibo, because some of those issues which I've highlighted in regards to the team not necessarily bailing them out and also the individual mistakes, they looked a little bit better in those games. It's just about seeing that now on a higher stage at Worlds, and hopefully we see the sleeping giant of TheShy awaken once more and find some of that form again.
And I think one of the unsung heroes for this WBG or Weibo Gaming roster is Xiaohu. I mean, this guy is, I think he's underappreciated when it comes to, I describe him as a very selfless player sometimes, where he is taking certain matchups, he's taking the Gragas flex that usually is taken for TheShy. He's playing that in the mid lane, right? He's flex Gragasing mid lane. He's getting 2-3 bans sometimes thrown his way, right? His LeBlanc, his Nico, stuff like this. I mean, shit, he's taking things like Talia, Yone occasionally. He's playing all these plethora of champions, and given the kind of player that he is and how long he's played, obviously he has that deep pocket champion pool to pick from. But can you maybe highlight as kind of how selfish Xiaohu is sometimes within this Weibo Gaming roster, where he's not necessarily playing just for his lane sometimes, but you can see it often than not, he's just trying to give his team the best chance to win.
Yeah, I think in terms of selflessness, I think that's actually more of a symptom of a larger cause. Because he will definitely give up resources for other stuff. The way I see it is that Xiaohu, within a draft, regardless if he's playing a champion in say Azir is a great example of this. If he's playing Azir in a game where his team outranges and they have really good front line, he knows he's playing DPS, and he will be a bit more selfish in that regards. He understands his role within that game. I'm trying to remember if this was against NIP. I think it was against NIP, actually, their playoff series. He had a couple of different Azir games, and he played 2 different roles of the same champion within different drafts. Because there was another game where he realized, actually, they have a Jinx. We're not outranging. Even with the Azir, it's kind of hard to play outrange because it's a Jinx, right? And I'm trying to remember if they had Jinx Ivan at that point too, or whether it was the Ivan on their team. And he realized, actually, I got to engage. I got to dive as this is here. I'm not backline outranging. And instead of going for Leandris, he went for Ludens into Shadow Flames. Be you know what? I'm going for burst combos. I'm going in and I'm shuffling in. And so Xiaohu is very good at understanding his role within that game, and he is very unafraid to play initiator in that point too. I think that's why he has been a great Nico player, one of the best Ahri players in the world. I think that when Ahri first came into meta in spring 21. Or rather spring 22 rather, so last year in spring, I think the 2 best Ahri players in the world, as opposed to what other people think in regards to the Chovy and the mechanical players, I actually think Faker and Xiaohu were the best engaging in Ahri players of that time. And I think that speaks to their mindset and some of these older great gods of the mid lane, realizing their role within a game and being able to sometimes die and be selfless in that regards, in terms of actually, I'm going to give up this wave because it gets me into a better position for someone else to take farm or for me to engage, or give up their entire life and say, look, I got a Zhonya's, it'll be fine, and make those big engage plays. And I think we saw a return to that from Xiaohu in certain games at this point on stuff like that. Azir in playoffs, it just the kind of the wider thinking to take that responsibility upon themselves and say, actually, I got to make the big play even if I die, even if I look like an idiot, and then also make it work as well, has been really, really good. He was catching out that Jinx in that game against NIP 3 or 4 times in late game. Their early game was really rough, and then suddenly he's okay, I got to make the big play, and he just does it. There is a certain amount of class which is really exciting to see from that.
And you hinted earlier that the jungle change was kind of one of the biggest, I would say, changes to this roster, obviously, and WeiWei was kind of this glue piece that somehow put himself in a position to work together with his solo laners very, very well. Can you maybe highlight what WeiWei was doing? Because when you look at him jungle, I'm not saying he's having Tarzan level performances where he's just doing more with less, but he is playing stuff like the Poppy. Obviously, the jungle meta didn't really favor these more aggressive, carry style stuff. So he's playing stuff like Wukong, I think Sejuani. He's got a bunch of Vi games. I think Vi was consistently banned against WeiWei as well. Can you
talk against everyone in the LPL in fairness. But yes, he was also very good at that.
Yeah. And can you to me talk about his style and how he meshes well with TheShy and Xiaohu and what they're doing on the map specifically? Because I think the way WeiWei and Xiaohu kind of move on the map together is very, very integral to how this team wins.
Oh, absolutely. I think WeiWei has just been much better at responding to his lanes than Kasa. I think Kasa, in a lot of games this year, felt like he was like probably, half a screen too far away from one person on an invade or an engage or something like that. Whereas WeiWei was just better at like finding the right timings and the distances to play around his teammates. In terms of the champions he was playing, actually quite versatile. We talked about the Poppy quite a lot. And yes, he had things like the Vi, which was great for him and Xiaohu to play something like Vi Ari or something a bit more bursty in that regards. I also was very interested when he started playing stuff like the Ivern at points as well. Because again, that's a stylistically very different champion beyond that. I think they played a couple of games of that through playoffs. I can't remember if that was in regionals too. I think actually it was JJ that played it against him a little bit. I think he played one game of that. But
yeah. He's got a couple games of Nocturne in there too, like with the Nocturne Nico combo that they were running as well, right?
Yeah. Well, and like I think that kind of combo is really good to see in terms of again the coordination when you're making the big engaging plays, which of course I think when you look at a lot of the big players on Weibo right now, and you think TheShy, and you think Xiaohu, Crisp as well, actually, because he was a huge Leona player and stuff like that. Even Light with how aggressive he used to play. All of these players are really good engaging front foot players. So they want to be casting their skills at you and finding fights on their own terms. WeiWei playing combinations well, that kind of synergized with that was really important to this team. So he had some great Rel games, he had some great Poppy games, he had some great Ivern games. So it's like, it's not even like it's the same. You have different archetypes in there where you have the heavy engagers like your Poppy, Rel. You have some more intricate combos like the Nocturne, but the Ivern's in there too. And it just felt like the most important thing was actually, it doesn't matter what champion he's on. He's in the same mindset of the great players on his team that sometimes need a little bit of facilitating because they are known to overforce a little bit too, which is, of course, the downside of Weibo.
Yeah, and then you hinted at them, and I like to talk about bot lanes, not necessarily individually, but kind of first opening up how they work together, because Light and Crisp, this bot lane, I mean, you've got a lot of Aphelios from Light, you've got a lot of, like you said, Rakan, Leona. I think, the meta as it shifted, he started playing on some Milio. I mean, there's a couple Blitzcrank games, I think, in there occasionally. Can you talk about Light Crisp as a bot lane and how they kind of work together as a duo and what they really excel at? Because I think bot lanes kind of fall into one of two kind of paths, right? They're either this really stable, like never lose, like we're never going to go super far down in CS kind of bot lane, or you're the bot lane where you're constantly trying to skill check. You're constantly trying to push the edge of the envelope. You're playing for plates. You're playing for dragon control constantly. You're shoving in the enemy laner. You're making it like so that every CS that they have to take, they have to figure out how much damage they can take. Can you maybe categorize Light and Crisp in one of these two bot lanes, or maybe they're a mix of both?
In the LPL, every lane is a hard lane, in fairness. I feel like it's just the nature of it. I think that we have a historically strong pool of AD carries in LPL currently, and you could argue that it's stretched for a couple of years. I think that this year, the consistent level of AD carries is higher than maybe any role we've seen ever. You look at the very top AD carries, when you think you've got like Light, Jackie Love, Gala, Uzi, even though he wasn't on form, like he's still in there and he's still competing against a lot of these people. You have Elk, you have even Abel was world class for large parts of summer. He fell off at the end, but he had some great moments too. It was very hard to sit and be stable because every lane is kicking your ass if they have that chance. I think that Light has evolved from being a player when he was back on LNG, where he was aggressive to the point of over-aggression on stuff like Lucian and Ezreal and stuff like that. I think he was over-aggressive at that point. I think he's learned to temper that aggression where he can push it just far enough without going beyond the edge there. I think that Light has become more stable as a player, but he still retained that cutting edge. So I think him as an AD carry, having stuff like Aphelios, which is very good to, gale force forwards and join the play with like your big ultimates too. You have this unique blend of being utility, engage, burst, but also being like a scaling hyper carry in the backline too. And I think that's really helped, particularly with the Aphelios like that, to enable some of the cool hook champs which Crisp has. He's played a couple of Blitzcrank games. He loves his Rakan, as you said. I think Crisp Rakan has been showing some of the old Crisp. I don't think that Crisp ever fell off like super, super hard, but we miss seeing that kind of that godlike thresh engage kind of pick support that we used to see from FPX back in the day. I think them as a duo, I think they've been more than fine in TV2. I think they really push other TV2s. They're not the outright best TV2. I think that, you put them up against, Elkin on or Ruler and Missing when they were at peak this year. I think that, they go toe-to-toe with them and they can probably trade it there and back. They're not a liability. They're strong in lane. I think the real thing is the ability to actually pick these kind of combos in bot lane like the Rakan and the FLS that can follow through with the engage around the skirmishes and team fights too. Because that's kind of like what this entire Weibo team kind of builds up to. You look at all the teams like, wow, they're great at XYZ, but they really just want to commit to those team fights, which is basically what all the team ends up doing.
Well, I think you've summarized, Weibo Gaming perfectly. I think anybody would get excited to see this team. I think
they will coin flip against any team in the world, for better or for worse. Like, this team is wonderful.
The variability of this team. Like I said, they can quite literally. I wouldn't be like, you asked me like, oh, can Weibo win Worlds? Yeah, maybe. Like if they just flip heads like 10 times in a row. I mean, I think last year Worlds has kind of describe that like maybe these like lower seeded teams can kind of just pull it out of their pants here. Although there is the also added side effect of like there is always like generally one LPL team that just kind of bombs out of Worlds, and I think everybody's expectations is that it might be Weibo Gaming. Do you think that narrative is true? Just in specific, like there is always that one LPL team that kind of underperforms, let's say.
So I think that on the whole, and this is largely parroting what I said on Summoning Insight the other day as well.
Okay.
On the whole, this is the most varied set of LPL teams we have seen for a very long time, if not ever. I think that before, sometimes you'd have a team that was very, very good at a certain aspect of the game, or had one player that played a certain style which enabled this team to function. I don't think that is currently the case. I think every single one of our teams is very, very variable. I think Weibo is also variable too, particularly because they are one of the few teams that can commit to a 1-3-1 style. I think that because Xiaohu is an incredible LeBlanc player and can play a lot of things on side lanes very well, he's arguably the best 1-3-1 player of all time. This team can do some incredibly different strategies, so it's not like they're going to get to Worlds and suddenly the meta has fallen away from them, which is sometimes made a team collapse because suddenly, oh, this player can't play carries, oh, this player can't play tanks, oh, this player can't play XYZ. It's not like the champion pools are going to restrict Weibo. Now, of course, maybe we see something like, oh, actually, can TheShy blind pick anything in top lane? Because he was just blind picking Cassante for most of the summer. Yeah, that kind of changed a bit in regionals and stuff. I think that Weibo are varied enough and they have the class enough to turn up at a Worlds level to be an internationally caliber team. I actually think BLG might be the team that bomb out a little bit. And I know I'm here to talk about the other two teams, but like just briefly going into that, I think that BLG, they've shown somewhat of a lack of adaptation as compared to the other teams. I think actually the one team which is maybe the most rigid is BLG out of the 4 LPL teams that we're sending currently. And I think a lot of that is because they require very quick engage compositions to be able to just like take these big front to back team fights that they do and very quickly punish you. And that often does kind of depend on like certain picks for On. I think On was incredibly good around MSI, forcing engaged champions into the Enchanter meta. And I think that if that kind of thing falls away from them, they could be a bit in trouble. Whereas I actually think Weibo, they're a bit more versatile. So we will see what comes from that.
And, kind of moving on from Weibo and going to a bit of a different flavor of a team, in my opinion. Honestly, I love 2 of the players on this team, LNG. Not that I don't like anybody else, but like Scout and Tarzan are 2 of my favorite players to watch play League of Legends. And I think Scout constantly has just been underrated, in his career. I think he's arguably, if Ruler wasn't in the LPL, Scout, in my opinion, has a very, very, good standing and becoming or calling them like one of the best players in LPL but like this guy is just constantly doing work on any team he's put on. I mean, obviously he's a world champion in of itself, but the way he works with Tarzan, and then also Tarzan just as a jungler, even back in his Griffin days, like this guy just does more with less. Like I don't understand how these 2 players in the jungle and mid for LNG just they seem like, if they're on, they seem unbeatable almost. Can you maybe, with the intro of LNG, can you talk about these 2 players? Because I think these guys are absolute studs in their own right.
Yeah, they're the absolute engine room of this team. Of course, the big change for LNG from spring to summer was LP, their AD carry, getting subbed out for Gala as well. So there's another all-time great AD carry being chucked into that roster. So it's not even like they have to go it alone. But when you have like this core, which they have done some incredible things. I think a lot of people are softballing the Scout question a lot. I think even people are almost afraid to call Scout potentially the best player in the LPL because he is potentially the best player in the LPL. I think that he's definitely the most valuable player in the LPL on his team currently. I think he's providing unprecedented amounts of value to his team. He had a historic amount of MVPs per game from spring and summer. Like, he broke his own record from spring, and over the course of the year, he's had more player of the games than any other player in LPL history. And he completely deserves that. He was the best mid lane Tristana in the LPL. He was the best Jace in the LPL.
He's the best Jace, yeah.
he is maybe the best Azir as well, although when you've got players like Rookie as well, like it's a little bit hard on that, but I think he was probably the best Azir in the LPL. And consider all of them were so meta, and he had an incredible Nico too. This guy was popping off in the meta and defining the meta too. It felt like if you gave Tristana to this team, you lose. If you gave Jace to this team, you lose. And there were a host of champions where it felt like Scout just was not allowed to have. And then that allowed a huge amount of presence for his team in the draft, because Zika was sometimes in the top lane. Sometimes earlier in the year, he required certain champions, like I think it was Renekton and Jax Gwen were the 3 champions. Like he kind of needs those 3 champions. LP a little bit in spring as well, kind of needed Varus. I think with Gala in summer, his champion pool also allowed them to do some really fun stuff. But of course, the extra thing in this too is actually, it's not just mid, it's mid jungle. Because the way that he piloted these champions were really, really good for Tarzan. In spring, they were playing stuff like Lee Sin, Annie, hyper burst mid lane combos. They also played very heavy invade things like the Jace again, but it was Jace Elise. And then of course that evolved into Jace Maokai in the way that it did across the entire world. And this has just continued beyond that point, because it has felt like if you give Scout an early pushing lane, or anything that can combo up with his jungler well in terms of kill combos or in terms of roaming combos, you just lose the game. I think on an individual level, I think that Kanavi and Knight just about outvalue Tarzan and Scout as individual players. I think that actually Scout and Knight are pretty much the same level, especially since Knight had some pretty duff games towards the end of Plus and then finals as well. I think Scout arguably was better than Knight in finals. It's a close run thing, but considering how freaking good Knight is, that's an incredible statement in its own right. But the coordination between Scout and Tarzan is what really made Kanavi and Knight really sweat. There were points where, like, one of them was slightly overextended and they just die. They don't get the room for error at that point. They were blowing flashes, they were dying. And I think actually at this point, we haven't seen it internationally, and Tarzan is a bit of a choking hazard. If they turn up on form, I think this is the best mid-jungle combination in the world right now.
I was going to say that. Like, throw the gauntlet down. Let's give the respect that they deserve. Scout and Tarzan at their peak. Oh, well, anyone at their peak, but like these two guys, they are the best mid-jungle duo in the world. I legitimately think so.
I think the question is, coming to Worlds, are they going to have the same, because the meta's changed, are they going to have these same absolute killer mid-jungle combos ready for Worlds? And can they do that and both of them perform to a Worlds level? Of course, Scout, we know he's a world champion. I don't have worries about him. Tarzan, this was his first finals since 2019. It's been a very long time. The last finals he made was in Griffin in the LCK. He never made a finals before. He went to LNG. LNG finished 4th in 2020, and they made it through that run to Worlds through 2020. Yeah. And then they had never reached that again. They hadn't been back to Worlds. This is the highest LNG has ever placed, and a lot of that reason was Tarzan kind of choking a little bit when it came to playoffs. That was kind of his thing he did in the LPL. If he can find that old godlike Tarzan form and Scout is alongside him, that is an incredible duo. And of course, the rest of the team is incredible too. I think the reason that they could go toe-to-toe with JDG, I think there are two things. I think Zika in spring was a bit of a liability. I didn't like the way that he played with individual advantages. And in draft, he was very, very susceptible too. But Gala was also an incredible late-game carry in summer. And it allowed them to have, like, you weren't going to out-hyper carry Ruler, but you could do just enough that the rest of your team could outvalue with that macro as well. Gala was like the one person, maybe besides Elk in a couple of games, that could really bring it to JDG at that point too. So I think all of that together made LNG genuinely a world-class team. And in terms of my expectations for Worlds for them, I actually think they could be a contender. I think they could take down JDG at Worlds. I think this team, a lot of people are sleeping on them. This team is genuinely world-class.
I think my only critique for this team is my questions surrounding their support, right? Like, because I feel like This guy kind of locks in Nautilus. He's the Nautilus guy. Like, he is the Nautilus dude, and he's pretty underwhelming on things like the Rakan. I would even say the Rel flex when possible, right? It was potentially being able to flex in the jungle. You could throw it into the support. Can you maybe talk to me about Hang's weakness and kind of like, if you have any worries about him, do you think he can adapt to the support meta? Because it's you know, there's other stuff coming in. I mean, similar champions, things like Alistar, stuff like that. I think we've seen some inklings of Braum here and there, but Nautilus is still very good. Do you think as long as he gets his Nautilus, he's fine? Or do you think it's worthy of teams throwing a ban over to him? Like, hey, get him off Nautilus, and this guy just isn't the same player.
And his Leona's just as good in my eyes. I think his Rakan's fine. Yeah, I think the thing with a player like Hung is he's quiet on this team, and that's largely because you have maybe the best player in the league in your team is Scout, and one of the best mid jungles in the world in Scout and Tarzan. Oh yeah, and Zucker's been going back towards carries as well. It's very hard to actually spare some time to go towards Hung. He is the unsung hero of the LPL, I think. I think a lot of the combos he plays is actually to enable stuff like Gala on poke champions when he's gone to gone towards stuff like
he plays Ziggs. He's got a couple Ziggs games in there.
Yeah. He had a Ziggs game where he had 50% of his team's damage. Like, Gala is the best Ziggs player in the LPL by far. He is actually an incredible Ziggs, and that's partly why this champion pool has been influenced. If you're playing something like Ziggs, and sometimes something like a Varus too, you want a heavy CC duo that can lock someone in place so the full combo lands, even if it's half a screen away for a Ziggs ult. So that means Nautilus going like hook, passive ult, Leona like EQ ult, you have Rakan with his big combos too, and that has allowed stuff like Maokai Tristana and then like Ziggs Leona or something like that to be absolutely busted, where one person gets caught, they get absolutely nuked from across the map, towers fall with it, the game just ends. I think that Hung is great at enabling that style. If it comes through to something, I don't know whether it will come through to this, if it comes through to something like an Enchanter meta, I don't know if he's going to have as much agency. Yeah, you've got some great carries again. And I do think that I think that one of the big things that Hung does is lock in support, engage champions, and like combo up well with Tarzan for like jungle support and then mid jungle support as well. I'm a little bit worried if these practice combos get removed from them and it's a big meta shift and then suddenly he has to readapt to it. That's my question. I don't think he's a bad player. I think he's quiet on a very loud team, which is not necessarily a reflection on him, just how good his teammates are. If anything, I think the liability of this team is Zika losing the form which he currently has. That's what lost them a lot of presence in spring, and OMG's blasted them because Shanji outvalued them. I think if that happens and suddenly you come up against like a T1 Zeus is in huge form, or any of the LPL teams with their current top laners like blasting them too, that's an issue because I think you can solo lose internationally through top lane. Although, I mean, that's kind of like just seeing on current form. I think currently actually Zika's been incredible on that front. And yeah, then of course maybe some of that practice combos falling apart.
Yeah, and you talked about him, and I just want to kind of get the expose on Zika because this guy, he's got Scion games, he's got Renekton, he's got what the typical, the Renekton, Jax, Cassante that's been consistently rotated in the LPL, right? You play either one of those three champions and you just try to see who gets the better of the matchup, but he's also got stuff like the Gwen. I think he's got Gnar games in there. I think he's one of the guys that has like a couple Scion games. Like, it feels weird to talk about Zika because, yeah, he's not, I wouldn't say he's like the sexiest player when it comes to this roster.
He was the biggest buyout of 2022 to 23.
Yeah, he came from IG.
The LPL teams, he had like a huge paycheck on him, but he wasn't necessarily where the focus was,
Yeah, and so I want to like kind of talk about this player because it feels like, I'm not going to say he's a plug and play kind of top because like you said, like obviously the LPL really values him, but it seems like you said the focus of this team is not on Zika. It's just, hey, Zika, play what's in rotation, and you have a Scion you can lean to, this kind of stuff. Like even Tarzan, like you said, he works really well with Scout, but it feels like the Zika Tarzan, if there ever it needs to be that duo, it's not as clean cut as some other maybe top jungle duos that are initiating things like dives that are just being really clean on the map.
Yeah, it's not necessarily where they've kind of gone to first and foremost. It's like, if things go topside, it's because Scout is one first, and then Scout and Tarzan then run topside, and they take Herald and stuff like that. They're very formulaic about how they play through that. It's not necessarily through, I mean, we've seen T1 do, we've obviously seen BLG and Bin do this on cooldown effectively. Zika, what he wants to do is to take an impactful 1v1 matchup where he can get a slight early lead and then grind that out around the course of it. Hullbreak and Gnar, he was winning games solo off of that occasionally. We saw some Fiora games where he was getting large leads, but then couldn't capitalize because his team was team fighting too much with the Fiora. That was a bit of a worry. That's why the Gwen and good matchups has done really well for him too. And stuff like Jax has just universally done well in the LPL.
Yeah.
Jax is incredible around there. So if you get something like a good Jax or a good Gwen matchup, or actually he's like, oh, you know, I'm going to play even into something like a Renekton or more likely something like a Cassante. It's like, just give me one gank early, just one pressure gank. Doesn't even have to get the kill. And then suddenly he's like a huge force later into the game. And he's kind of like another insurance point for the team. That's been really important. Stuff like the Renekton's been pretty fun in his team fights too. I think that Zika on Renekton has been very good at finding good angles with the rest of his team to get on top of the AD carry and then just like shut down a key carry around the first Herald fights, the first Dragon fights of the game. It really does depend though on how nailed in the drafts are though, because if he does actually fall behind early, we have occasionally just seen this guy just like fall behind way too much. I don't think his tank play is where I want to see him. I want him on bruises or carries. I don't really feel a lot of the science stuff beyond that.
And now, we've talked about both of the teams. We've set them up. Obviously, we don't have like group draw brackets or anything like that, but I think the interesting thing to know is that this is the first year for the Swiss stage for the Worlds teams, right? And
yes.
So when talking about LNG and WG in Weibo Gaming, do you actually think the Swiss bracket like maybe favors them a little bit? Do you think it's actually Swiss is better for these kind of like obviously higher tier teams? Let's just call it how it is. Like these guys are heads and shoulders above some of the other NA teams and EU teams. Do you think Swiss actually favors them? How do you actually think? Let's start with Weibo Gaming. Like, are they the team that could just be like 0-3 in the Swiss bracket potentially, or just be 3L? Like you said, the variability of these guys is crazy.
I'm pretty sure that qualification and elimination matches are best of 3, but the rest of them are best of 1, right? Is that how it works? I'm trying to remember.
I think you're correct. I think
it's something like that. I think that aspect of it helps because you're going to need an oopsie game for Weibo. You're going to need one. Because this team, I don't know what to tell you, buddy. You're going to need an oopsie or two. Like, this team is not letting you go home without your share of, like, heart attacks. Like, this is the triple bypass team of League of Legends. Like, you are going out of this tournament with heart surgery. Like, they are the fast food League of Legends, the best of it and the worst of it. They need a couple of games to dial in their meta, Weibo especially. I don't know what that will intend. Maybe it's the kind of thing where suddenly it's like, oh, Xiaohu, he's going to lock in a LeBlanc as a comfort game, and that's going to stabilize the team. Suddenly teams have to ban a LeBlanc against him, so they can't 1-3-1 you into death. Maybe it's something similar for someone like TheShy as well, where he's found like a comfort blind pick champ at that point. I think that this is a team that could bomb out. Like I said, I actually think that it's potentially BLG that comes into a threat there, because I think that they've shown a tendency to not adapt very well when things don't go well for them. Now, of course, they could dice roll and the meta works out perfectly for them. I think that if the meta falls away from them, they're less adaptable than a team like Weibo, though. I think that Weibo, I think they can afford a whoopsie, and I don't think they're going to be losing huge games to like lower tier teams. Even though they did it regionally though. I don't know, man. I think that if they might take a game to warm up. I think this team should be one that should muddle their way through it.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a controversial thing to say that LNG should just, kind of come out this Swiss.
All of the teams which are most stable, LNG are the LCK team in the LPL. Like, they play things out super formulaically. They get winning. If they ever get winning lanes, like in mid game, where they can push in side lanes with a Nazir or a LeBlanc or a Tristana, you're just done. They're just way better at playing macro. They out macro JDG for almost the entirety of finals. They lost 3-2, but like they were so good at playing around, pushing lanes. But even JDG were like, we're really good at starting fights, but we've lost all our lanes across the map. How do we do that again? And even like the Golden Road team couldn't figure out an answer for that in the majority of finals. That should tell you how good this team is. Like, I find it very hard to believe that LNG would be the team to bomb out, because they were so on top of how they would play pushing lanes. And that is a transferable skill, in fairness.
Do you think LNG is probably the most slept on team coming into Worlds? Like almost like an EDG-esque, like, and it's so funny that it's also another scout team that's the most slept on.
Yeah, I think so, because I think the teams which people are, I think that JDG are tournament favorites. I think they're in a bracket of their own. If you're tier listing it, I think JDG, even if I don't think the gap between JDG and then the next team is as high as some people think, because we're rolling the dice on the meta. There's a chance that things go a bit skew if there. I think you have JDG. I think you have LNG in the tier below.
Does Genji join them?
Well, this is the thing. Atlas was on Summoning Insight the other day and basically said, can you believe in any of these LCK teams realistically? Because, they've all had their worries at various points through this split. I I think that you put LNG there, and then it's a question mark on Gen G, because I think you're really just hoping that it's like a Chovy meta, and like Pays is comfortable as well.
Yeah.
I think if it becomes about carry tops, you then really worry about Gen G, because I think that, you know, you've got Doran, who's okay. I think he's actually done pretty okay this year, but like going up against like a Bin or a 369 who is just really good at just outvaluing in any of these pseudo carry matchups, like,
oh, by the way, they got even 20-pound counter picks, by the way, in their pockets.
Exactly.
So, like, they'll just take this wacky matchup that you're like, well, shit, I don't know what the fuck to do in this. Like, yeah.
Yeah, so that's my real worry, I think, because so I think that right now, from an LPL perspective, it's JDG then LNG, and it's like a toss-up between like Weibo could flip their way to a title, BLG, it's dice roll on the meta, I think. It really, and even then, they've just shown their kryptonite is JDG, so it's very hard for them to like overcome that, because I think BLG, realistically their problem is their strength matches up with an even stronger strength from JDG, where it's like, haha, we're going to punish you misusing a cooldown and quickly pick a fight. JDG are the best team in the world at doing that. Your strength is actually a weakness now against them. So that's why the individual matchup is so poor there. It's maybe if it comes down to carry top matchup, maybe T1 has to be rated somewhere in there. Again, I don't think that they are above LNG or JDG. I think that they have to be like firmly and like that, maybe equal to LNG if the meta shakes out for them. I think that's loosely how my tier list kind of goes. I think LNG absolutely most slept on team across this world though, because the teams that people are focusing on is like it's gonna be JDG and then T1 in there, and Gen G just won the LCK as well. Oh yeah, BLG, we know them from earlier in the year. No, LNG are legit, like they are my second place team in power rankings right now. Like you cannot sleep on this team.
Another scout team. Like how many times are we gonna count out Scout before this guy just like cements himself as like a legit threat? And so now I'm gonna ask you to reveal some trade secrets, Nymaera. I'm an NA team. I'm an EU team. I'm Worlds Team X. I say, hey, give me the blueprint. I've got 5 days to prep for WBG, Weibo Gaming and LNG.
Oh,
where can I like look to find out where can I outvalue these teams? What can I do here? I'm asking you like right now, guys, NA, EU, take notes. Nymaera's revealing everything. Let's start with Weibo.
I think with Weibo, legit, I think a lot of it comes around TheShy, right? And whether you can easily make an insurmountable advantage come through topside. I don't think you want to take a risky matchup topside, but you want to have a matchup which can either outvalue in team fights and force TheShy to make risky plays to stay ahead of the game. So like, as we've seen with like Renekton, he'll make like a couple of early plays and you get hope, and then he tries to do that later into the game, and he just continually dies 1v2 or 1v3 on a side lane. You want to have either a matchup which outvalues in team fights through topside, or something like a Gnar, which kind of is the jack of all trades, where it pushes you in lane, it pushes you in side lanes, and has team fight advantage. It builds up a hull breaker, and you're just kind of screwed. That's my kind of worry for Weibo, where it's actually like TheShy doesn't know how to outvalue when the matchup doesn't allow him to. The way he managed to manage this in regionals is like he'd just lock in Ornn and outvalue in team fights, and like that was absolutely fine for him. He'd managed with that, and he'd struggle with stuff where like he'd need to build up an early advantage to stay ahead. And then even with stuff like the Gwen, he'd at least outvalue in late game, and he did well at that point. You want to limit 1-3-1 champions from Xiaohu. Like you just can't allow him to have like a LeBlanc or something like that. He's the best 1-3-1 player in the world, and he will single-handedly buy the space that TheShy needs to then become relevant in the game. I think bot lane is quite hard. I don't think it's an easy way to shut that down. I think it's largely through stop Xiaohu being able to bail out TheShy, have a matchup that TheShy slowly slinks into oblivion into. That's how I beat Weibo.
So there you go. That's the Weibo
Oh,
blueprint.
and deny Rel jungle support flex. They use that too well in regionals too. Just don't let them do the Rel thing. It's just
ban the Rel, ban the LeBlanc, even though the LeBlanc is, insane. This guy is just, he creates so much presence, like that aura, right? Like in anime where it's like, oh, it's like how much can he create here? And so that's the, let's say, weaknesses, key points maybe. For LNG, it's a different story because like, I don't think you can break this mid-jungle duo. I don't think that's possible. I just simply do not believe that you are going to, with any matchup, come into this mid-jungle duo and say, yeah, let's fight him, firepower for firepower. I think you've got to look either to the bot lane or potentially in that topside matchup, and similar to maybe attacking, TheShy in the topside, but in a different variant, a different form, right?
You pick a god and pray. That's your first thing. And you just hope it really works out for you. Maybe you can like feed them like a little like fish bone and just hope they choke on it and hope that Tarzan chokes on stage, literally. You're hoping you're not facing this team first, or you pick up some good scrim info and you hope that someone on the team is telegraphing their picks too much, whether that is Tarzan or Zika. I think that's the most likely one. Scout's champion pool way too large. Gala has the largest AD carry champion pool in the LPL, and Crisp even then has like a lot of side picks too. You're hoping that top or jungle gives up like the Death Star plans of like, this is the one key opening
hole.
where actually it's like, oh wow, it's like there's like this 1 2-meter draft hole where like they're gonna pick Renekton in this spot and it's gonna be all like a jack. They're only gonna pick these 3 champions. We've got we've got this perfect counter prepared. You're hoping that comes up. LNG are the most stable team in the LPL, and besides maybe JDG at that point, right? I think they're both very stable teams where like that's very hard to overcome their strengths. They're not gonna have off days that often. If they're on form, it's very, very difficult. I don't think there's an easy way to beat this team, particularly if Scout has like these incredible pushing lanes. Maybe if he first picks a Tristana, you can have something like a Talia pick coming in. That's been what we saw from EMEA Masters. I think a lot of the French teams, the LFL teams, Carmine Corps obviously, used that to great regard, great strength too, when they won the EMEA Masters this last time around. You're hoping that they make a big draft oopsie and they're not prepared for this adaptation, because there were a couple of times where they were a little bit flat-footed earlier in summer when they had to catch up to the meta again. You just got to catch them before they get to that point. Like if they're on the meta, on the game, like good luck.
Okay, we are nearing towards the end. I know it's pretty late for you. I ask every guest this question. Nymaera, I don't know if you've already thought about this, if you did it already on Something Insight. What is your 90-50-10 for, I guess, just the worlds in general, or you could just do these 2 teams. It's up to you. I want to hear your 90-50-10.
I think it's 93 Chinese teams and knockouts. I think it's genuinely that certain. 90 on that. I think the gap between East and West is really, really high right now. Unless the meta completely flips that. So I think 93 Chinese teams in
knockout stage.
In knockouts. 50.
Is it, Weibo Gaming makes it to quarters?
I think it actually might be. Oh god, I think it's above 50 that Weibo make it. Oh god, is it? I don't know. This team. 50 is a harder one. I actually hadn't thought about this.
Could just be Billy just flunks out. Not let's say Swiss, but maybe just.
I mean, maybe I think it's a 50-50 between Weibo or BLG flunking out. It's one of those two, but it's like Weibo BLG. One of those two is flunking out. 10%, I think it is an all Chinese finals. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's 10% all Chinese finals.
Is that due to just the way the bracket is? Because they'll just be like self-elimination.
Like as far as I'm aware, like you can team kill that. It's quite hard to get a same region finals. Actually, I think it's 10% all Chinese finals. Actually, is it?
Assuming no NA and EU teams make it to the knockout stage, which I think is a general assumption right now, you might be able to get.
It depends which things are like. If you get an uneven split, we have like 2 Chinese teams on one side of the bracket and one on the other. If it's JDG on like the Korean side of the bracket, I'm like, that's actually pretty likely.
They just plow through every single Korean
I think
team?
the odds work out. I think the odds work out just about, but like just depending on if it's like a 2-1 split, depending on which team's on the one and stuff like that. I think it's a 10% chance all Chinese finals, which is not obviously high. I think it's quite high that you're going to have like one of these teams like running into a crazy opponent sometime later into it. Obviously, you're then waiting on like, is JDG on like, are they going to team kill all the Chinese teams?
Yeah.
Are they going to be on the Korean side of the bracket if they make it through in the first place? God forbid that they actually like lose in groups in Swiss or something like that. Yeah. I think so. 90, I'm going to say 3 teams, 3 Chinese teams in knockouts. 50-50 BLG or Weibo falling out in Swiss. 10% all Chinese finals.
I think that's a pretty solid 90-50-10 here. And so, Nymaera, with that, I appreciate, taking time out of your busy schedule to come. You are obviously on Something Insight. You probably went over a lot of this previously. Where can we find you? What are you doing? I just want to know, like, what are you doing? Plannings for the off season? Are you like Worlds co-streaming? I have no clue. I haven't been really paying attention. So
I'm not co-streaming. Co-streaming was invite only, and I've not been streaming nearly enough to be invited to that one.
Fair enough.
In terms of off-season, as many League professionals out there will know, I'm waiting to see what comes my way. I'm putting my name out there. And of course, my brother Sam is actually not in the other room. He's not in the house right now. But me and my brother are looking for all opportunities across casting, any region, anywhere. We just really love casting League of Legends. Love to be involved in LPL next year. Love to be involved in LEC next year. I'd love to be involved in ERLs next year and anything else that comes our way. As for the moment, yeah, I'll be streaming a little bit. I'll be hanging out, watching movies in my Discord, and overall making memes on Twitter and the rest of it. I'll be putting my thoughts out on LPL and the LGL, of course, DFM. I know Sam spoke to you about them the other day. I'm very excited to see. I've got not many expectations for them, but I hope the best for them all the same. And I'm just waiting to see another great tournament of League of Legends.
Yeah, Utapon is my goat for sure. Like,
I know, right?
He initialized as
Rolls
gotten the
Foster
Kool-Aid.
the top lane, still the best top lane in the region after not playing it since 2017. How do you do it?
I've been drinking the LJ Kool-Aid after I talked to him. I'm like, damn, this guy's actually the
They're
GOAT.
not going to win, but they're a great story. They're not going to win, but it's great. That's why I support them, man.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Nymaera. Hey, everyone. Just popping in here to remind you that if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, as that always helps out. Don't forget to leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts. I try and respond to as many as possible. And last but not least, please hit that subscribe button and click on the notification bell so you guys know when my latest video is going to get uploaded ASAP. Once again, I appreciate every single one of you and hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night, and look forward to seeing you back here very, very soon.